Hello learners and welcome to the 11th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I have introduced the poet Thomas Hardy and given a lot of cultural as well as biographical background to an iconic and memorable collection of poems that Hardy published in the year 1916. This collection is poems of 1912-1913, and I described how these poems are a very important contribution to the history of the elegy in the English language, but also they inaugurate, in some ways, they are quite a revolutionary break in that history as well. They are written at the cusp of the 20th century, and also they introduce a new way of writing elegy. In a way, Hardy introduces the new way of writing elegy that 20th century poetry will be known for. The key difference between this new way of writing elegy and the earlier ways of writing elegy is that poets refuse consolation. The poetic persona is willfully and quite adamantly disconsolate. The lack of consolation is not an accident. It comes from the poet's fearlessness, the poetic persona's awareness, and ultimately a realistic and a materialistic view of emotions. Emotions cannot be willed into being. Emotions cannot be written out of existence. So, an elegiac reconstruction of an idealized figure cannot substitute in the grieving poet's mind the figure of the person who is no longer alive. This awareness translates into the work of many 20th century poets, and in Thomas Hardy's collection, Poems of 1912-1913, we get a very powerful and early articulation of this idea. I have given a lot of background. I will now proceed to read some words from Hardy's collection itself. This lecture will be an exercise in reading aloud as well as critical and analytical reading. I will read portions and sometimes entire poems, and through my reading, I will illustrate some of the newness and the power of elegy as it is demonstrated in the work of Thomas Hardy. I will begin by reading a poem. It is in fact so famous, it is considered to be among the most iconic and powerful poems that Thomas Hardy ever wrote. As it happens, this poem creates a somewhat misleading and somewhat inaccurate picture of what Thomas Hardy did as a poet. Why is it misleading and how can we make that picture more accurate? I will describe that after I read the poem. The poem is titled The Voice, and it is the 8th in the sequence of poems that make up this very iconic collection. The Voice is the 8th poem, and here it's how it goes. The Voice. Woman much missed, how you call to me, saying that now you are not as you were, when you had changed from the one who was all to me, but as at first when our day was fair. So this first stanza is already revealing the complexity, the emotional complexity of Hardy's position, both as a grieving, lonely, mourning, longing person, a person who is consumed by his longing for someone who is no longer alive. At the same time, this longing is complicated by the awareness that what he is longing for is not a real thing. In fact, he is in some ways misleading himself by indulging this longing. And we can see this complexity in this line, that the woman he misses calls to him, and so he is hearing the voice of this woman, and in the voice that he is hearing, Hardy is becoming the mourner. But the voice itself, if he pays attention to what that voice tells him, he realizes that he is wrong about some things. And why is he wrong? The voice, once he pays attention to it, tells him that she herself, that is the woman he misses, is not now as she was when he knew her. That is, saying that now you are not as you were when you had changed from the one who was all to me, right? But as at first, when our day was fair. So there are several degrees of change happening in these four lines. So already in these four lines, we can see that there are multiple degrees of transformation happening. The voice that Thomas Hardy hears communicates two levels, two stages in the evolution of this person. The first is an idealized state. This is Emma Gifford as Hardy remembers her during their courtship. The second is a changed figure. This figure is someone that Hardy did not remember until he started mourning for her. And what is this change? He describes this change thus: when you had changed from the one who was all to me, but as at first when our day was fair. So there are two figures. One is Emma Gifford as she was when Hardy and Emma, when Thomas and Emma's days were fair. That is an early stage in their relationship, in the courtship. And Emma in this figure, in this version, is different from Emma as she had become in the later stages of their relationship. Now, the key thing to note is that it is in the act of mourning, it is in the act of remembering Emma as she was in an earlier stage that Hardy is forced to confront with something that he had suppressed. What is that? He had suppressed the memory of Emma as she had changed from the figure that she was. So Hardy had suppressed the version of Emma who had grown distant, who had begun to dislike, who had grown to be very, very alienated, and whom he himself, that is Hardy himself, had done much to alienate from himself. It is this figure, there is this version of Emma, which is no less real, but which Hardy had suppressed in his grief, that he is now forced to confront through the act of writing about his grief. Right? So this is what we learn in the first stanza. Let us now go forward. Can it be you that I hear? Let me view you then, standing as when I drew near to the town, where you would wait for me. Yes, as I knew you then, even to the original air blue gown. So he is describing two things again. He is continuing the two parallel lines of memory. One is their early courtship, when everything is rosy and he's looking with pink-hued glasses, as it were. And the other parallel line is a later stage when things are no longer as idealistic, when there is a lot of difference and distance between these two people. The poet is struggling to reconcile these two. The poet has got the glimpse that these two versions are actually the same person, that it is in fact the truth that the same person who was truly, madly and deeply in love with him at one point, at another point had grown to dislike him, had grown very distant and alienated. That is the fact. This is a truth that Hardy is beginning to glimpse, but is struggling to accept. He's struggling because it challenges his notion of their past as being very idealized. Further, it also challenges his notion of himself as an innocent victim. He would like to believe that he is a victim because he has been rendered lonely by the death of his wife. And he would like to continue holding this notion. However, it is in the act of writing about his memories of an idealized young couple in which Emma was this very beautiful woman who pleased him. It is while remembering and writing about this memory that Hardy is forced to confront something else, which is that he had done something to alienate his wife. And he is struggling to accept that this is in fact the case. So that's what explains this line, can it be you that I hear? And his solution or his strategy to clear the confusion is to pay more attention, to look and to hear with more sensitivity, with more care. And when he pays more attention to this voice, he fleshes out more details. But these details happen to be of an earlier time. And he describes the original air blue gown. Right? So we see that the poet is struggling, and occasionally stops to comfort himself, and occasionally that comfort dries up, and he is forced to confront himself. So, this is how the first two stanzas go. There are two more stanzas. Let us read what happens there. Or is it only the breeze in its listlessness, travelling across the wet mead to me here, you being ever dissolved to wan wistlessness, heard no more again, far or near? Thus I, faltering forward, leaves around me falling, wind oozing thin through the thorn from norward, and the woman calling. So the poet is confused. On one hand, he feels that the voice that he hears is real. It belongs to an idealized memory. Not only idealized, but in fact, a true, factually correct memory, the air blue gown. On the other hand, when Hardy pays more attention, he feels that no, it is not real. In fact, it is just the breeze, that it is the same breeze, the same leaves flying around him, the same natural surroundings, which means he is traveling to the place where he had traveled in the past. And it is simply the coincidence that he happens to be in a space again, and that is confusing him, that is creating the illusion that the voice in fact belongs to the one he remembers. And not just the one he remembers, but how he remembers her. And it is this illusion that what he remembers was not in fact the case that comes home to him again. He feels that in his memory he has hidden some facts. He has chosen to forget some facts and chosen to remember only some facts. And this is how the poem ends. He says, wind oozing and the woman calling. That the wind oozes, that is, nature continues its relentless course, its cyclical course of death, renewal, destruction, and the cycles of growth continue. But one very key thing, or the most important thing for Hardy, is missing in that cycle. Why? Because human life is singular and finite. And it is the life of Emma Gifford that has gone missing. So Hardy remains in this confusion. The confusion is between two contradictory facts. The first is that the voice that he hears is in fact true, that he is a victim because he has been abandoned by the woman who he remembers as an idealized person. The other truth is that he is not a victim. In fact, he is as much a perpetrator as a victim, because the woman he remembers, if he remembers her accurately, and memory becomes stronger, memory becomes more accurate in the act of writing the poem. If he remembers her correctly, then he will also remember that he has done some things to push her away. Between these two memories, between these two versions of what happened, Hardy fails to reach a conclusion. The only conclusion is that he is confused. This is how the poem ends. Most popular readings of this poem would like to read it as a poem of powerful, eternal, universal longing. However, there are hints in this universal expression of longing of darker truths, unpleasant, inconvenient truths, of power dynamics, inequalities, acts of violence, emotional and epistemic violence, inflicted by intimate partners upon each other. And the poet is fearless enough to glimpse these unpleasant truths, but the poet remains somewhat scared of fully realizing what these truths can mean for his act of remembering his wife, because he remains somewhat scared, somewhat frightened to go that far. There is an intellectual dark space that the poet is beginning to clear, but somewhat fearful of truly stepping into. That is where this poem ends. This is a very famous poem. I will now go ahead and read the opening poems of this collection, because this is very important for us to realize how this collection begins and how Hardy's first readers would have encountered this very powerful collection of thoughts. The epigraph, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is from Virgil's The Aeneid, and roughly translated, the epigraph in Latin can be rendered into English as traces of an old flame. And I also gave some textual background to this. These words are from the fourth book of the Aeneid, in which Dido, the queen of Carthage, speaks these words to describe her love for Aeneas. And I also described how Hardy positions himself both in the position of Dido as well as Aeneas. And it is this ambiguity which speaks to Hardy's honesty as a poet and Hardy's openness to accepting some unpleasant truths about himself. This is how the first poem begins. It's titled The Going. Why did you give no hint that night, that quickly after the morrow's dawn, and calmly, as if indifferent quite, you would close your term here, up and be gone, where I could not follow with wing of swallow to gain one glimpse of you ever anon. So the first stanza begins with an accusation. The very first words, why, right? Why did you give no hint that night? Puts us in the middle of a very intimate conversation, as if a couple is having a quarrel. That is the intention of these words. And if one thinks about that genre of conversation, a quarrel between man and wife, it gives us more understanding of the particular tone in which Hardy writes these elegies. The person who has been rendered alone by the death of one partner begins a poem by accusing his partner of having left him alone. We can interpret this accusation in many ways. At this point, maybe it is simply an expression of grief, and there is no anger here. Why did you give no hint that night? Can be read as an innocent expression of grief. But as the poem goes further, we will see how this innocent expression of grief, expression of simply an overflow of powerful emotion, will actually overflow into a sort of anger, right? Ultimately, this anger will point itself not only at Emma Gifford, the wife who is dead and no longer with Hardy, but also at Hardy himself. This is how the next stanza goes. And actually, before we go to the next stanza, you would close your term here, up and be gone. Term here, of course, refers to the earth, that is the realm of the mortals. And Hardy accuses Emma of not dying or not planning the hour of her death to Hardy's convenience, right? And if one thinks about it in that way, it's a ridiculous thought and somewhat unfair and extremely presumptuous, not to mention a little bit condescending. Nonetheless, we are expected to understand that this condescension or this presumptuousness, all of these are coming from a somewhat innocent place, that the speaker of these lines is not aiming or intending to humiliate or shame the person for whom he is longing, but rather he is simply unable to control the grief that he is going through. Let us see if we can sustain this reading, this justification of the apparent anger by referring to a deep-seated grief. Let us see if we can sustain this reading as the stanzas follow. The next stanza reads, never to bid goodbye or lip me the softest call or utter a wish for a word, while I saw morning harden upon the wall, unmoved, unknowing that your great going had placed that moment and altered all. Right? So Hardy describes the first morning, the rising sun, the course of nature going forward in its endless cycles of recreation. Every day the sun sets and the sun rises. That cycle renews itself. It has no bearing, and it has no concern for whether one human being is no longer alive. It has no concern for the human being who is left alive and who can only perceive the absence of one person. Psychologically speaking, this is a very accurate description of the first stages of grieving. Anyone who has lost, who has experienced loss, who has gone through bereavement, will acknowledge and attest to the fact that the first morning, that the first few days after the process of funereal mourning and all the public rituals are finished, it is the ordinariness of grief which is the most unbearable. And this is what Hardy describes. He's unable to bear the non exceptional, the ordinary nature of grief. He notices that morning hardens upon the wall, but his wife is no longer there. Everything seems as it was, except that his wife is no longer there. This is a very difficult, powerfully, almost impossible to bear experience. And out of a confusion, out of not knowing how to explain this, Hardy falls back and begins to blame the person who is no longer there. We can see that not only the mourning is hardening upon the wall, but also the resentment, the anger that comes from a lack of understanding, a lack of understanding of how to process this grief, how to experience life, how to go on with living when everything seems to happen normally, but his wife is no longer there. This confusion is fueling Hardy's resentment because his anger has been silenced into a powerful emotional force which he doesn't know where to direct. And he realizes that her great going, that is, the disappearance of his wife, has changed everything. And he's unable to explain how or how to move forward given that everything remains the same or appears to be the same, and yet everything feels different because there's one person who's no longer with him. Then Hardy writes again. Again, he starts accusing her. Why do you make me leave the house and think for a breath it is you I see at the end of the alley of bending boughs, where so often at dusk you used to be, till in darkening dankness the yawning blankness of the perspective sickens me. Right? We can see that in these last line, the perspective sickens me. He's going through the motions of his day. That is, he has left the house, gone for a drive in his horse-drawn carriage, and he's seeing familiar sights, sights where he might have seen her when she was alive. That is, at the end of an alley of bending boughs, so often at dusk you used to be. Right? So he sees natural surroundings, remembers a time when she was there, and notices that those natural surroundings, bending boughs, right, at dusk, sun setting, trees laden with fruit, but his wife is no longer there. And the lack of his wife, realizing that there is one key thing that's missing from his life, produces a very powerful reaction. The perspective, right? This way of looking at his life, this way of looking at the life of his that he's familiar with, sickens the person, sickens the speaker of this poem. We can see that the poet is getting angrier. He is directing more and more of this very strong negative emotional energy at the person who is no longer there. The poem goes on. You were she who abode by those red-veined rocks far west. You were the swan-necked one who rode along the beetling beanie crest, and, reigning nigh me, would muse and eye me, while life unrolled us its very best. Right? So he describes a very familiar image, that is, she would be his companion while they rode on a horse-drawn carriage and surveyed the the countryside, right? The western countryside, the district of Cornwall. And life unrolled them in its very best. That is, there was a sort of pastoral idealism to the sights and sounds that Thomas and Emma surveyed. And he remembers very fondly those sights and sounds. Again, the poet asks a question. This is not a rhetorical question. It is not, why did you do this or why do you do this? But a slightly more somber, slightly more tempered question, but nonetheless rhetorical because he's asking a person who is no longer alive. The question goes thus: why then, latterly, did we not speak? Did we not think of those days long dead, and ere your vanishing, strive to seek that time's renewal? We might have said, in this bright spring weather, we'll visit together those places that once we visited. Now, this is, I think, the heart of the poem, the lines where the poet manages to convey a deep and a tragic sense of exactly what is wrong and what is missing. He's not accusing Emma anymore. He is asking her a very almost weakened, powerless question. It is almost a sigh. It is not an active question. This is a question that is futile because he knows the answer to that question. Nonetheless, the question seems extremely important to the poet now that he knows that nothing can be done. What is that question? The question he's asking his dead wife is why, when they still had the opportunity, they did not try and repair their relationship. Why then latterly did we not speak? Did we not think of those days long dead? So now he's remembering a stage not in the best part of the relationship, but a little bit later when they were merely going through the motions, when they were traveling in the same places, but they no longer perceived the natural beauty with the same degree of joy and pleasure. At that time, he's asking, why did they not act differently? Right? That is, and he says, ere your vanishing, strive to seek that time's renewal. Right? That is, before Emma died, right? Why did Thomas and Emma not try and regain what they had in the earliest stage of their courtship? Right? Now, clearly, the poet is being disingenuous here. The question is directed apparently at both of them. So the poet says, why did we not think of those days? Did we not speak? Right? Strive to seek, right? We might have said, etc. On the surface, it seems that the poet wants to know how and why both of them failed. But in fact, Hardy knows that it is he himself who has failed. So the accusation, this is not simply a question, or it might be phrased like a question directed at both of them, but it is in fact an accusation, a powerful and damning accusation that the poet directs at himself, in which he wonders why he did not repair this relationship while there was time. That is, why did he not realize exactly what was good and how what was once good had been ruined before the death of his wife? And this is an accusation that the poet pleads guilty to because there is really no explanation or excuse that the poet can give. He can simply express a longing for that. The poet writes, why did we not think? And we might have said that we'll visit together those places that once we visited. And here there is hope as well. Hardy writes, if they had simply repeated in a very mechanical way some of the actions of their courtship, maybe the later years of their marriage might have been spent better. They might have thought better of each other had they only revisited the places of their courtship once they were older. And the final stanza now, well, all's past amend, unchangeable, it must go. I seem but a dead man held on end to sink down soon. Oh, you could not know that such swift fleeing, no soul foreseeing, not even I, would undo me so. Again, having blamed himself, the poet returns to a more wistful and sighing and somewhat neutral sadness. The poet says, nobody could have foreseen that your sudden disappearance, right? That your swift fleeing. Again, instead of blaming his actions while she was alive, Hardy seems to blame Emma for simply disappearing. And again, in that change of register, in that change of argument, Hardy acknowledges that there is something very egotistical and something very selfish about this poem itself. That it is Emma's death, ultimately, which has triggered this realization of Hardy's mistakes. Whereas, as Hardy himself describes in this very poem, the better thing would have been for Hardy to realize his mistakes while Emma was alive. So, this is a hint, a trailer, as it were, of how this collection will traverse a very diverse, turbulent, rocky, emotional terrain. The poet will strive for comfort, but comfort will be very hard sought, very, very difficult to find, if at all. The reason the poet will never find comfort is because the poet is too astute, too aware of the mistakes that he has made to be able to allow himself that comfort. And the mistakes chiefly apply to his own behavior, the things that he did while Emma was alive. I'll stop there and continue with the discussion of elegy and 20th century poetry in the next lecture. Thank you.